my studio over to three parts. First, some framing. Second of all, some arguments, and third of all is about our impact. So I'm gonna start off with five main framing today's debate. A is what is the purpose of social movements. So purpose of a social movement is like often to advocate for the rights of a group of people or to solve a social issue. And so I think the basis here is that the people you're trying to protect are happy and protected. So like you're not going to go advocate for like utopia right changes like in the policy, but people like in the bottom in the bottom of the social status is being harmed. So the basic here is always to protect the people first and then advocate for bigger changes. And second is how these changes are going to carry out. So you can see that they're both activism on social media, like via hashtags, and it's also going to be offline peaceful protests and also offline activities, etc. And third framing here is what like is the stakeholders. So we believe that the big stakeholder in this debate is and will always be the minorities, people that are suffering from abuse, people who are suffering from racism. So these people are always the key to these protection and the biggest stakeholder. And so OG is that is going to protect them and ensure the carrying out of our policy. All right, now a few comparison between the local activism and the national level activism. So because like all the key here is that the problems, the vulnerability are all being tracked down, are all being found inside local areas. So you're not able to see how people are suffering from national level. Instead, like it's only when you go down to the community, like we go down to the streets, like inside a certain local area, that you're able to see the issues and pinpoint and figure them out. And because these issues they're being found out in these local communities, it's also more important that you solve them within these local areas. And second, by prioritizing local activism does not mean that we're not pushing for national change. Instead, on OG, we would like to start simply from a local level and then expand our impact towards the national level, because again we're prioritizing them over them, not just like ignoring and neglecting national level. So this is easy, and this will make our case more easy to achieve, because A is that they're gonna be a smaller scope because the local community is much more smaller compared to a country
UI.
city. And second is that a small scope means that this activity is easier for us to control and to allow more mistakes. And once we have our experience and we set a fundamental basis, then we can like push our movements on the national level. And that's on framing. And also two arguments. A is physically justified. So on the OG team, we're actually empowering the marginalized communities. So why is this happening? So because like as I mentioned earlier, that the communities that are marginalized, they're the biggest stakeholder and they're being targeted the most in today's debate. And so thus, OG agrees with that local activism often gives voices to marginalized communities who might be overlooked national conversations. So by focusing on local issues and focusing on local people, activists can ensure that these communities actually have a platform to advocate their voice. Because you're not going to expect like a people from a slum to be able to talk on the UN or be able to be a million like Instagram follower. And this is the reason why that actually by empowering these communities, we're giving them like a voice. We're giving people the platform to actually speak their truths and actually let the world know what they're suffering. And this is the most efficient way because these people speaking out for themselves is the best way for us to tackle the issues, find out their real sufferings, and actually find solutions and activism to solve these issues. So thus, like the justified reasoning here is that we're a team that is actually empowering marginalized communities, and we're giving them the voice and the platform to speak up. And now moving on to practical arguments, we have three main arguments. First of all, it's on setting grass. First of all, it's on building grass. Real power. Can you wait a little bit? All right. So we believe that in order for like an active movement to actually be successful, you need to have people that support you. And obviously, you're not gonna get that support in the national level in the first place. So only when you have like local activism, that you're able to gain like this grassroots support from the people, and you're able to get people that actually support that are going to like support your activism movements. And this support is important for us to be mobilized for larger national efforts. And also local successes can serve as a model for other communities, leading to ripple effect of change. So when we have this basis built up, it's much easier for us to expand, and we have people to always support you and back you up. And argument two here is not addressing local issues. So because these issues they're within local community, and we want active, practical, and immediate change. And activism in local in level directly does that. So layer one is on pinpointing the issue and increasing accessibility. So by having local activism, we're able to do more infrastructures within a certain community. We are able to like just make small policy changes within a small area, and this can ensure that these policies, these structures can be accessed rather easily to ensure that people who are stakeholders can be benefited directly. So instead of like national level activism, like they might be too inaccessible or they're just like unreachable for people like that are suffering the most in poor areas. So we believe that we're actually increasing our like accountability and increasing accessibility. Our second is how like a smaller scale means that it's easier to carry out, and like our impact is more tangible and more efficient. So local activism often leads to more immediate and visible results. So looking so like working at a local level, activists can see the direct the direct impact of their efforts, whether it's like improve local policies, better community service, etc. And this immediacy can be more satisfying and motivating for change to be involved in the future. Is there a POI?
Yes, for example, people are suffering from high medical bills, and if you don't change the law of high medical bill standards, how do you think you can solve the issues?
All right, so basically you're thinking about an utopia that if I want to start, like if I want to like carry out activity that I must make immediate policy change. But this is intangible and inefficient because like obviously you are like a movement will take years to complete, and like a training system will cost even more time. So thus like even though you believe that you can solve this immediately, so your entire impact is just like not efficient because like it's not gonna happen immediately. So like you need to work out from a basic level. You need to ensure that there are people to support you, and you have enough experience before you put like people like you put your ideas on a national level. So like our process might sound good, but it's like so hard. And basically like Ethiopia, that's impossible to carry out because like you're not gonna make policy change in like 3 minutes. But we're able to like make a local policy change, like how we can have like more funds for people to pay their medical bills in like 3 months or something. So this is more efficient, and we actually went on time frame that we produce a more tangible and immediate impact as I have proven already. Now, third impact here is on community engagement. So we believe that local activism so like, can actually foster a sense of belonging and community within like these people. So as people work together to like so people they're directly working solve the issues that are working in their lives. And this community engagement can lead to stronger social ties, a deeper understanding of a community needs, and increased participation like on the civil level. So actually what you see is that we're not only giving them a platform to speak up, we're giving them a platform for them to actively work and giving the people like a chance to work for their better lives. If you have a national policy already, like it's hard to ensure that people they can take part in, and it's hard to ensure that people they can actually work themselves, and it's hard to ensure that the policies will like can actually tackle down towards the poor people. So we're ensuring that with the strong community engagement, people they are actively working themselves hard to ensure for a change. That's practically and principally, I'm also proud to urge a ballot for opening governments. Thank you.
Before I go into our two arguments, which are that national activism is more effective in centralizing resources, and secondly, that national activism creates a united community, I first want to um do some recharacterization of what national and local movements actually look like in the status quo. So I think that national movements, there are four things to note, which is firstly that they're usually cooperation between multiple social activism groups, which means that multiple groups, perhaps from like different regions, they unite together to create this movement under like a single name or like a single identity. Secondly, is that even when we're trying to focus on national activism, that doesn't mean that we just completely ignore the people in our local community. For example, like we can feature them on the social media movements and use this to help raise awareness about specific areas, but it just means that the overall movement is about like a national change. Thirdly is that I think that national movements they focus a lot more on shifting like the culture or shifting awareness towards a new direction for like a country. And then finally is that the goal of national movements is to reach as many of people as possible compared to local movements where they're just trying to reach a few people in the community. And so I think that the major thing about local movements is that local movements do not exist everywhere. So for example, if you're an LGBTQ person that lives in like a very conservative small town in the countryside, that means that you probably don't have a local activist movement there, and therefore that person can't gain access to any resources that help them when they're like facing things like conversion therapy and when they're surrounded by people who don't accept their like queer identity. And so I think this is the most important thing in the debate, which is that even if we're not able to directly be near the person that needs help, I think that national activism offers like wider scale help to everybody that needs help, whereas local activism means that some people don't get included, and so I think that that's the biggest
Sure.
harm. So our two arguments are firstly that national activism is more effective in centralizing resources, and then secondly that it creates a united identity. So under centralizing resources, I think that this is key in this debate because the only way that we're able to create practical change is by using the resources that multiple groups have. And this looks like A, where you have power in number, and this means firstly, that it's harder for individual people to be targeted. For example, in conservative areas, I think that's very easy to face backlash. And this can look like both violence in extreme cases against specific leaders, because usually local movements only have like a few leaders who are like bringing this whole thing together, or on in like other ways it can be like media attacks on like this local movement that undermines their credibility, because a lot of these, like for example conservative like presses, they want to use their power to like manipulate these like their viewers into like not believing these local movements. And I think this is a lot harder to do when you have so many people across the country that are able to like voice against this type of backlash. But secondly, in terms of power and number, I think that we're able to gather more people for things like strikes and campaigns. And I think that this is central to a lot of activism movements, because it's the like one of the best ways to show like the people's defiance against like whatever issue they're facing. Um and then secondly, I think that gathering like centralizing resources allows people to get like media awareness. And especially today, I think that media is one of the main ways for movements to gain prominence. For example, like the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matters movement, they all like mainly revolve around social media. So I think that this exists in two ways, which is firstly that when you have a lot of social capital from all the people that are part of your movement, and like some like prominent leaders that are able to like join together to create this movement, that I think that this means that, for example, you get more control over the press. So you're able to actually tell them your story, and you're able to, for example, gather the money to fly to some like disadvantaged places to show the actual situation of what is going on, compared to if you have a local movement, then even if you're already in this place, you don't have enough social capital to actually be able to garner awareness about these issues that exist, because you don't have a big enough platform to voice these issues on. Secondly, is that these people are able to get interviews on like a lot of like major broadcasting networks, which is a way of reaching people who aren't necessarily involved directly involved in the movement. And what this means is that when you have when you have a local movement, that means that the only like the main people that you're helping are like the people who are already involved. So for example, if you're like an LGBTQ movement, like the people that you're targeting is LGBTQ people. But a lot of other people, for example, like people who aren't LGBTQ or like potentially homophobic people, they don't get a lot of access to this movement in the first place because of how small this is. But if you're able to get interviews on like mainstream media, then this means that you get attention from like the general public, and this means that you're able to solve a lot of issues by targeting not only like the minority but the majority as well. But then finally, for example, for like the Me Too movement, they heavily rely on like celebrities to like endorse their movements. And I think that this is only possible when you have this movement on a large scale, when you're able to gather social capital. But then finally, I think that on our side, we're able to fund like large scales campaign for the movements. And I think that the effect of this is that uniquely when you have large scale movements, for example, like media campaigns, then this means that you're able to put more pressure on the government and put pressure on the authorities to change legislation, to pass laws, for example, that protect abortion rights. And then you're also able to reach more individuals on a larger scale to help pressure individuals to, for example, if you're an environmental movement, to change the way that they behave. And I think that if you're a local movement, then you have much less ability to reach as many people. But secondly, why is it better that even if we fail these direct impacts, why is it still better to have a national movement? And I think that this is because with national activism, you have a united identity. And this comes in 3 points, which is firstly, that you're able to find others. For example, if you're a member of the LGBTQ community, the only way that you're able to find others in your community for a lot of people is through national movements, because you get to meet them online, for example. But then secondly, in terms of ideological splits, this is a huge issue in the status quo, where local movements have differing like viewpoints. And I think that this can a lot of times undermine the movement, but we're able to resolve this through national movements. And finally, having national movements, again, with like the number and power, creates credibility, especially if you're not undermining each other when you're, for example, like advocating for your own movements in your local regions. Thank you.
Judge, the entire opening opposition speech is incredibly flawed. This is because they give analysis to just one point, which is that some movements are unable to be represented locally. But we did have just one point of refutation to this, which is that if you are unable to make change locally, that you are not, if you are unable to have like any representative locally, then you're not a part of this debate, right? Because the motion of this is how we should prioritize local activism as opposed to national activism, not to the point that if you can't even have any local activism, why would you be considered a factor in this debate? Because literally you can't, it's not like you have a choice to prioritize anything, because you have to only do national activism. So that's the entire first argument gone. But secondly, let's look at what they said about how like because let's look at how they said how like they somehow have like developing movements as people who can get like celebrities, right? Such as like whatever they said about like the Me Too movement, where they're only able to be like represented because of celebrities, right? The big movements all came from a small movement, right? And slowly turned into that big movement. And this is exactly the same as understanding from going from a small local activism as opposed to a national activism. Because after you get this small stepping stone of being able to get change in that local activism, it's a lot more easier in the long term to be able to have a stable security to make sure that you're still able to make some amount of change before moving on to the national activism, where you had to connect more voices, which is completely wrong of what OO was to say. And the fact that if you want to achieve national activism, local activism is a sense of evidence, it's a sense of backup to you as to what you're able to make a lot more change than when you were to just prioritize national activism in this debate, right? So let's see. I just have one thing to make really clear, right? What we are arguing is not that national activism is bad. We are arguing that by prioritizing local activism as opposed to national activism, it's actually able to make a long-term benefit. You're able to actually make change as more beneficial to the nationality in the long run, and you're able to make change that is more like visible, and you don't have to co-opt with the bigger countries that are completely suppressive over you, right? Well, finally, these are local voices. They said local community has too many different voices to which that you cannot control them. You have to move on to national activism. I'm really confused at that point, because even in the national field, there's even more voices, right? There are even more people that want to make a lot more different perspectives of change. So why is it that we want local voices more, right? This is because, one, local voices are still able to are still a lot more easier comparatively to make change. And when you make change of the local voices, you at least know what the other bigger community wants. So when you want to try and achieve the national activism, when you make change on the national level, you're able to co-opt some of the benefits, and you're able to say like, look, we'll give you this benefit, but we won't actually ask you the same benefits as the local community, because then you know what the community wants easier from that local voice. So that's their argument completely down. Third argument then, which is how we have a cultural and contextual sensitivity, and that avoids a top-down approach. What this looks like is that national activism can sometimes overlook or misunderstand the cultural and social nuances because you don't understand it, given you never really prioritize local activism at first, right? Because national activism, you guys said how like they have like more resource, to which we concede to that, right? But let's like be charitable and say like national activism has as many resources as they can to be able to like help a lot of countries. But it's hard to ensure that these resources will be allocated to that small part of the platform, right? Because given that country already is a developing country and already don't have like the voices that they need as a social activist, as a social movement, then of course, if we want to make change in the local community at first, you're able to make change to which the national community, you don't have to be completely dependent on the national community, because the national community has other stuff to do rather than dealing with a small developing country. Moving on then. So how national activism can sometimes overlook and misunderstand cultural and social nuances within communities, and that leads to resistance and backlash, right? Local activism, on the other hand, is inherently more attuned to like these different nuances, and that allows for like more culturally sensitive and more like contextually appropriate approaches, right? So this looks like an environmental activism in rural areas might need to consider like traditional land use practices and local economic dependencies, because you want to co-opt to be able to make more change in the national spectrum in the future. And this is important because, one, by prioritizing local activism, movements can develop customized solutions that are specifically designed to address unique challenges and needs to community at first, right? But this customization increases the likelihood of success and ensures that these solutions are sustainable over the long term. This is debate winning because, one, we're able to think of the long term, right? Because these small steps, these small stepping stones are really useful to build this steady base rather than just taking a huge leap. And that can be more stable and more sustainable with the changes that we have made, because then you're able to you're able to better fully understand what the community as a whole wants, right? And secondly, you have a less risk of backlashes. This is like the ability to co-opt and get more change rather than if you were to just suffer from suppression as a minority. If you immediately move on to the national spectrum, because that is what opposition is supposed to be arguing about. And thirdly, we have a better allocation of resources because we prevent power resource allocation movements, which is basically how if the national community wants to prioritize those take for example in China, you would want to prioritize these bigger countries just like Shanghai, or you want to prioritize Beijing because they already have more contribution to the national society. So if you only give it to if you only depend and make change in the local community at first, you're able to have a more stable change, right? So just a bit more on what my prime minister has said. So basically, local activism is essential for building a strong grassroots base, right? This looks like the building of like a backbone to any successful social movement, providing the energy, creativity, resilience needed for these long-term efforts, right? This is important in this debate because grassroots movements are less vulnerable to co-optation or suppression of these developing countries because they are decentralized and deeply embedded in the community, right? So by focusing on local activism, movements can be more independent, and that causes self-sustaining ecosystems of change, right? And that ecosystem, like, for example, consists of networks of like local organizations, leaders, volunteers who continue to like push for progress, even as like national attention shifts to their issues, and that ensures that social movements are not just fleeting movements of activism, but instead ongoing efforts for change. So what have we proven to you this debate, right? We've proven to you why, one, we're able to have more of a long-term and less risk of backlashes benefit. We've proven to you why the entire opposition speech was basically just completely impossible and based on really extreme terms. And for all reasons above, so proud to be on side OG. Thank you.
The power of a nation overpowers that of a community, because when we work together as a country, that is when our potential is maximized. It becomes the best of what we are able to achieve. The power of cooperation may sound pretty cliche, but it's what fuels us to be able to do the impossible. The first thing I'm going to do is just give like 2 clarifications off the top of my speech. Firstly, I just think it is important for us to read the motion. We aren't opposing local activism as side opening opposition at all. We just prioritize national activism over local activism. But secondly, I just don't think that OG really characterizes to us what local activism likely looks like and what they're trying to solve. So we're just going to assume it's some individual problems within a small community. Then multiple things I'm going to chat about in this speech. Firstly, some characterization. Secondly, rebuttal on their case. And lastly, introducing our last substantive on how in the community, activism at a local level reduces the direct impact of social movements. So then on recharacterization then, I just want to characterize what local activism looks like, because I think OG never like clearly tells us what it actually is. So I think down the bench, that is why we've been as confused as we've been. So we think we would actually characterize local activism as something that looks like likely just some small problems within a community, i.e. your village, town, etc. But secondly, that would look like the number of people within that community is less than what it means on a nationwide basis. But lastly, local activism, we would say, is actually more hands-on or helping specific individuals or family rather than the whole demographic of people. What would we characterize national activism to be like then? Firstly, nation, countrywide, problems like Black Lives Matters, feminism, abortion rights. But secondly, we would argue for the solvency of root problems to a whole system that applies to the entire country. But lastly, a lot more funding, resources, people, as well as perspectives and ideas. So the problems within society then is that the biggest problems within society would likely be systemic issues existent in all local areas of a nation, i.e. racism, feminism, abortion rights. The delta here is just that on like a local level, it's just varying, right? So then rebuttal. The first thing they tell us is like their stance. They have a pretty slippery slope stance. They tell you, oh, we can do local activism before national activism. But note that what you do at a local level sometimes does not apply to that of a national level. This looks like certain small policies in your community that are in place, but not to the rest of the country. This looks like people are less likely to care around the national level if they really want to argue for that, which I think harms their argument about giving power and voice to activists. Furthermore, I don't think that they explain to us how this will happen either way, so I just think that this is like out of debate either ways. So responding to their first argument on how they talk about activists can have platforms to be able to talk, and they can talk about their root sufferings and put their justifications on social media, they get a national level like voice. the response here. Firstly, one thing I just want to say, what's next? Why does it matter? What's the impact? Because I don't see why this is far more urgent in comparison to the nationwide problems national activism is trying to solve, like poverty, homelessness, etc. But secondly, I think the comparative isn't that bad at all. Yes, local activists talking about their local issues can get recognition on their side, but I think that on our side, you're still able to, at a minimum effort, the motion isn't to completely oppose all local activism, but to rather prioritize nationwide activism. If it is really that pressing of an issue, I think it is still able to be solved, like even like by a little bit. But in their best case, then, if it is really a pressing issue within the community, I would actually argue that a lot of the problems local communities go through are actually subcategories and variations of big national problems. This is like homelessness in a certain area or region. Know that the moment you are able to advocate for homelessness and the betterment of that for the entire country, that is when the impacts of that spill down into smaller communities. But fourthly, I just don't think that this is true because you are not able to go on a national level because your problems are on a local level. You're only able to engage on a local level because your experiences as a local community differentiate from those of other local communities, right? So then the second argument they give us is that they need to build grassroots power. Thus, they tell you that you need people to support you. I think that there's a huge lack of impact here because I just don't see why getting more people to support you is better. But secondly, I think that we're able to co-opt this benefit as well because if you have a national-wide activism, that is when the most vulnerable people from different demographics are able to speak out, right? But thirdly, even if this is true, I think you're able to garner prominence on a local level through local activism. The amount of support you're going to get is only going to be at a local level, which I think isn't a lot either ways. But then on their third argument, which they tell you that they're able to help their community make smaller policy changes and it's better response here. I think this is true, but we are willing to bite the bullet and make this trade-off. But secondly, I think we are also able to help the community on our side of the house because the moment you solve bigger issues, those effects go into helping smaller communities. Sure, this might not be as specific culturally as to what is most efficient, but it's still a change and we're able to achieve this on a mass scale rather than having an impact of only like 200 people in a town in Texas. But then the last thing they tell you is that there's local activism and that national activism neglects the pre-existing cultural and social norms in certain states like land and agricultural methods, and they're able to address unique communities and increase the likelihood of success. The response here is that yes, we think that this will help the pre-existing cultural and social norms, but I just don't think that communities within a country are going to be that different. Most countries that protest are likely countries of democracy that argue for values of equality. That means that these local communities aren't going to believe in different values compared to the rest of the country and be living in a completely different world. But secondly, even if we do achieve this, I just don't see why this is just generally beneficial because the country is still extremely fragmented and not united. So then lastly, I want to extend onto our case about why activism on a local level reduces the direct impact of social movements. The first thing here is to say that there is less relevancy around the entire nation. People don't see the importance of social movements anymore because you are less united in terms of a specific goal because every single small community has their own goal, has their own problems within their community. That is when it becomes extremely fragmented. People do not know what is the clear goal they want to set. For example, in a certain community, they want to change the policy. And another one, they want to make people less poor. That is when you do not have unity. That is when people of other nations, of other local communities are less likely to care about your specific problem. That is when their argument on their side of the house just about like nationwide level and voice doesn't just stand. But secondly, there's less consistency because every community is trying to solve their own thing. But lastly, there's less support and people feel less strongly about a pressing issue. This is extremely detrimental as a lot of funding and resources, for example, from your local community to another local community will just be completely diminished, right? But lastly, I just want to take a step back. Why are we substantially better? A, we strive to solve for the root problems of huge nationwide problems. But B, by solving root problems of nationwide problems, we will eventually, and the effects of that will eventually trickle down and help local communities who may be suffering from variations of this major problem. For that reason, we are extremely proud to oppose.
Today in my speech, I will give our refutations and then give an extension that will be completely new. So firstly, I'm going to move on to our refutations. So the other side talked about how actually a lot of movements do not exist in rural places. Well, we believe that actually a lot of things people in rural places might care about might not actually exist on the national scale either. Like, for example, if I'm in this rural a place where I am of a minority cultural group, and we have problems regarding our culture, like if we have clashes with other cultures, or if our culture actually is, for example, diminishing, and we want to protect it. Well, would the national scale actually care more about this? Well, we believe that they won't, because they're not part of this culture and they don't know much about us, right? So actually, we believe that a lot of things might not exist on a national scale either, and so this is not actually exclusive to our side. They also talked about how people will be split into very small fragments. Well, we believe that firstly, local movement can also work together. It's just that they can have like one common big role, like for example, feminism. But you can also have like small movements within that, with each movement, having like different smaller goals to meet different places criteria. Like for example, in a rural place in a developing country, like for example, they might have a lot of women being very objectified, and a lot of women are suffering from a lot of these very, very extreme ideas. However, in a bigger city, like in a global city, people might not be that people will probably not be that extreme, because they have had a lot more ideas coming from all over the world. So women there are probably much more independent. So you can't really say like that you want one version of feminism, that you want feminism that only support that only like through maybe education support women, that let them learn certain basic things, because that is already not relevant in these big cities. But you can't also say like like you want to support like ways that only exist in like the bigger cities that already have feminism, because like it won't work in the rural places. So that is why we believe that we should have like for smaller groups, right? And now I'm going to give our extension. So we believe that actually, we believe that actually these smaller groups will likely not be affected by national trends. So what do I mean by this? So there are a lot of things that happen nationally. Like for example, in a democracy, a new politician gets elected, and if it's a national movement, they probably really, really care about these national trends, right? Because this impacts them very, very much. And so they're likely, like when this new politician gets elected, if they do not care much about that like about this movement, they probably will not get like the resources they need and things like that. And if like so that is why they can actually get easily affected by trends globally or nationally, like not just when a politician gets elected, but also wars in the global scale and things like that. So they'll not be able to focus on the issue itself. Well, why do local communities actually be able to focus on the issue itself? Well, we believe that people in these local communities, like for example, who support feminism or LGBT, they're likely going to not be affected by new politicians getting elected, right? Because it is not really relevant to them. They don't get so much resources like from the politician anyways. So likely what will happen is they'll still raise funds in their small scale and still try to be active in their small scale. So actually, this is why these are more flexible. And so like because also like we believe that because they don't have too many people and too many places to care about, when times change, they can also change in regard to this and still focus and maintain their particular needs that are not affected by when the time changes. So a national movement will not be able to do this as easily because, well, firstly, they have a lot of people from a lot of different communities that are affected differently by things like elections. So they're likely going to have negotiation problems, so they'll have to talk with people from all over the country. And also, we believe that since like they really heavily rely, since they need so much resources at one time to solve any small issue in their country because they're such a big organization, then they really, really heavily rely on the money government gets them and things like that. So actually, when like politicians care less about them, for example, they will not be able to still fulfill the needs of these people. So that is why, like, actually, we
Why?
believe that a lot of these are more flexible. Yeah.
So if a politician does not care about an issue, don't you think that that's what activism is for, to let a politician try to care and acknowledge an issue?
Well, yes, we suppose that that is true. However, actually, for these global, I mean, for these national movements, even though they are so active, and they want to like try to get all the resources, if they because they are big, they heavily probably rely on things like politician support, and what is exclusive is that for a lot of smaller groups, they're actually not too dependent on this, right? Because actually, even if the politicians don't give them as much support, they can still get people in the community are still very have like all the engagement, and they care about this because it is part of their community, right? So they'll probably still give the money or the resources and devote time to this movement. However, if it's on a national scale and it doesn't really matter that much to certain groups of people, they're likely not going to and because different groups have different interests and things like that, they likely have a harder time negotiating and having like ways to actually be flexible. So that is why I probably propose.
All right, so as a member of opposition of the closing opposition, we strongly disagree with the motion, and we do not believe that we should prioritize national activism. We should not prioritize we should prioritize local activism opposed to national activism. We believe that national activism can achieve a much bigger benefits for all of the people. So, all right, so in my debates, in my speech, I'll first give two extensions to our side's arguments, and second of all, I'll also talk about a few rebuttals for this for our side. All right, so to summarize the upper house debate, they basically talked about that local activism are small scale, and they can have much more direct impacts, while opposition talks about how national activism can be more effective in solving these problems. But we are here to prove something much more. We would like to offer an alternative solution in our extensions, and also prove how this can be much better for the long term. All right, so now moving on to my extensions. First of all, is that we believe that national activism is much better for the long term. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Issues like healthcare healthcare systems require a lot of solutions that can only be addressed at a national level, and national activism can create significantly more pressure on governments because they have a lot more people. This means that they can be more effective and in trying to solving these problems. They simply can be a much more effective way of combating these larger problems. So they have a higher chance of benefiting more people, including local communities. So how can this benefit the long term? So even if a national activist movement is not as successful, and it needs more funding, and it needs more supports, there's still a high chance that it will achieve its goal eventually. And when it achieves its goal, it will be of huge impacts. Just for example, there are many examples throughout history for this. For example, in the civil rights movements in the U.S. many years ago, in the U.S. there's the segregation of colored people, but because now it's a more national movement, they can get more resources and more support because they are bigger. They have more people, and they can get more resources. So now many national organizations like the NACP, which is the National Association for the Advance of Colored People, So because they can make a movements like this more national, more national organization, these people are able to step in and provide more people are able to step in and provide legal support for them, because they are a big enough movement, and they can create a big enough impact. Because of movements like these, national movements like these, the United States definitely has a lot of color, a lot less color segregation than many years ago. So we have proven that this can be much better in the long term, if in the long term, and can achieve much better results much more effectively. So now moving on to my second contention, where I'll offer a alternative solution as to local activism. So first, we believe that people already have systems in place to address local problems. We do not need local activism as much, as opposed to national activism, which addresses core problems that are much more difficult to solve. So systems, all right, I'll set one POI.
How to ensure that our national change can actually tackle down towards every community, and why can't
Excuse me?
so like how to ensure that all of your big changes will tackle down and there will be enough resources allocated to help every community, especially those that are very important, that are suffering the most.
So we believe that more resources can be allocated to national activism is simply because that they can cause a much bigger impact and much greater good, and they can have more recognition because they are a much bigger movement. All right, so moving on to my second point, we believe that people already have systems for local problems, such as city councils, county commissions. They already have citizen representatives that addresses local problems. And also, as the upper house has mentioned, we do not need too much activism. We want to prioritize national activism. We do not want to abolish local activism completely. We just believe that national activism can have a much bigger impact, and local activism already has many systems in place to address these local problems. Now, why do national activisms need activism instead of just like this? However, we believe that it does not work for national problems because they are simply too big for one community to handle. We need national activism to bring some recognition to these huge problems. National activisms can also be more effective at these problems, which is why we believe that national activism can cause a much greater impact because they have more people, more of an impact, and if they succeed eventually in the long run, they can benefit more people, including many local communities. So in conclusion, we believe that national activism is a much more effective way in combating these critically important problems that we face now in the world, and there are already many systems in place, such as city councils, to represent the people's voices. So now moving on to the second part of my debate, where I'll give out some rebuttals to the government's arguments. So in their member speech, they basically said that local activism can directly address the problem. However, we believe that we do not need local activism to address this problem. And even if we do, we are just prioritizing national activism, as we've mentioned in our second extension. We do not need activism to achieve this. There are already other systems in place, such as city councils, where citizens do have a huge voice to account for this. And also, in their member speech, they have also mentioned that national activism requires more supports. And yes, we believe that. However, and just simply considering the benefits if a national activist organization can succeed is simply outweighs this, because there's far better long-term benefits. So even if we have to wait for an activist movement to succeed, we can have generally much more benefits that can benefit most local counties to get rid of these problems. So in conclusion, we believe that we can provide a much better long-term solution, and we believe that local activisms are not completely necessary. Thank you very much.
Ultimately, this debate comes down to one thing: fulfilling the goals of these social movements. We think that as a social movement, the most important thing is the social part of these issues, and which we think here is the people. We think the goal of these social movements is to solve problems for the people, and that this is impossible or not realistic to do on a national scale, because so many people are different, and many communities are going to be unique in ways that national activism cannot solve completely. So first, I'd like to provide some comparisons in team by team, and by explaining why we win for each team. So first of all is our opening half, opening government. So opening government tells us about how this will lead to more engagement, efficiency, culture, etc. So what do we tell you in our extension? So we give our extension about flexibility and how this and how problems can be tailored to be solved with resources in these local communities. So we tell you that local activism can quickly change problems if they face like sudden issues. So we think it's much more likely that than on a national scale, because on a smaller scale, it means that if you're facing a problem, you can quickly take those resources and use them onto another aspect. So we think that on a national scale, it means that if you're facing a sudden issue, it means you aren't going to be able to quickly adapt or to solve the problem in another way. So we tell you that also these local activists won't be swayed by national trends. We think it's likely because these activists will be focusing directly on the local issues, and they won't have to be thinking about like all other sorts of other national issues or those communities that might have very like unique or different problems. So we think it means that these local issues can be directly and uniquely focused on these people instead of being all over the place, which is something we think would be likely to happen nationally because there's so much you need to cover. So why is this unique compared to opening government? So we tell you that what opening government focuses on is basically the broad impacts and like of engagement efficiency. However, we do not think this is the most unique or the most important part of side government. So we think that the most unique and important thing here is that the uniqueness of like local activism and the flexibility of local activism. So now even though open government talks about unique culture and how they can kind of adapt to the cultures, we think they only give us a surface level explanation, which is that they can like address different cultures. However, we tell you why locally policies are going to be solved better and why it is unique. And we tell you in our extension that this actually is because more flexibility. While what open government does is they aren't able to provide, they don't tell us the unique like analysis or mechanism behind why they can adapt unique culture, and they don't give like the details. So we think this is why the reason why we should win over opening government is that we tell you more about the most unique and important part on side government, which is that these local activists can focus directly on these problems. So now next is opening opposition. What does opening opposition tell us? They tell us that about the power number, how basically this when you solve larger problems, this can trickle down to help local movements. However, we think the reason why this point doesn't stand is that even if we take their best case scenario and where like they're able to somehow help these local movements, these local communities, we think it's still more effective to use local activism because it means that it's more flexible and that individuals within this community know themselves what problems that they need to have solved. And what this means is that they can directly take action when they identify a problem, and these local communities can focus resources directly on the problems that they're facing. And versus where in national like activism, it's going to be very hard to understand every single problem of local communities. We think this also means faster solving of problems because every individual within the community is going to know what problems they're facing, and they're going to be able to focus resources on it and tailor solutions. So what does this look like? We think that, for example, if you wanted to solve poverty and you were like using national activism, you would have to solve it in tens of states. And we think this means that many issues are going to be leaking through and they're not going to be able to be solved very well. So they'll end up being not solved or not being able to be like truly adequately solved because people and many of those people that previously supported the social movement might not support as much because they realized that the problems they thought were going to be solved were not actually addressed. Versus if you solve this locally, we tell you that every single state is solving the problem at the same time. And you have like parallel basically improvements, and each scenario is going to be more tailored and more flexible for that specific community. So especially for social movements where you're solving problems of people, we think that most people are unique and that communities are unique to like the problems that communities have are also unique. So what does our extension also tell you? We tell you that local activism won't be affected by national trends and they can focus uniquely on local issues. So we think the reason why we win over opening opposition is that we tell you that we're able to solve these problems that are more urgent, and we win on urgency because we can solve these problems faster. And second of all, we tell you that we can adapt to new problems if they appear because every community is going to be able to be focusing on themselves instead of having to look at the broad view of an entire country. So finally is closing opposition. They tell us that national movements may take more time, but they're going to have a larger impact and more effects. And also they tell us that they won't abolish local movements, but they think that national is better. So as I just mentioned, why we think that national movements are going to be much slower and why local activism can actually solve problems in a better, more tailored way. So the reason why we think local activism can use resources better and solve problems like faster and more effectively is that we think they don't have to consider all the extreme problems that the national activism needs to do. So for example, national activism would have to consider the worst case and the best case scenario because they're looking at a very broad scope. Versus in local communities, they don't have to consider as much of an issue because they're only talking about one community and that community is able to solve its problems itself. So we think they also tell us that they won't abolish local activism. However, we think that just as we mentioned, national activism isn't able to solve problems better and more effectively, especially for social movements, which is why we wholeheartedly support the motion. Thank you.
So today in my speech, I'll be first refuting some of the points from the government whip, and then I'll be summarizing this debate with 2 questions, and I'll be weighing through all the teams. So first is a refutation towards government whip. The government will first mention and clarify the goals of social movement, which is to solve problem for people. And she mentions that those problems for people are unique, and if you solve it in the national aspect with all the question collectively, you cannot be focused on on the specific question, and therefore you cannot solve the issue quickly and effectively. But we want to answer this in 2 ways. First, is it more unique and more flexible the solution is equals good? And our answer is no, because without legal actions or the changes in policies, or changes in the culture, you cannot solve social issues. That's basically you cannot. It's impossible. Let me give you an example of the civil rights movement in the United States before. So before, people are very segregated toward the African Americans and people with other skin colors rather than white. And because it is starting to become a culture, there's like segregation, and people are discriminating towards them and think that those people are born to be segregated because of the cultural influences from long ago. And because if you don't change the law of protecting those racial minorities, or if you don't change the entire United States culture, that generally think that yeah.
Are you aware that the civil rights movement started small in states and then expanded to national level? So why cannot we just start with local activities and then we expand to the national level? What's the point of prioritizing that?
But I just want to tell you that we should prioritize on the national level. If you only focus on small communities, for example, the civil rights movement, if you only focus on one, for example, like neighborhood, then nothing will happen. If you only focus on one state, other states are still segregating those racial minorities. And if you don't try to prioritize and tell other people that it's important to treat every people equally, you have no way to change. And for the civil rights movement, why is it successful? Because there is an organization called NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Because of those racial minorities are already in an unadvantageous position. If you don't seek help from national organizations, you will have no money, no people, and no one will think that you're correct. And now we move on to the questions in some of this debate. Is that first question is that is local movement possible to make changes that is more efficient and impactful than national social movements? I'll give you one example from India. For example, is that they see women as objects or commercial objects, and they don't have any women rights or any like human rights towards them. And if you want to change this, you have to raise awareness on the international aspect, but not within one community, because in such countries with those culture, it's already like in this country for hundreds of years, and it's impossible to change, and there will be nobody that will be listening to you because you're only changing in a small scope. However, if you change in a large scope, for example, if you tell this shocking news to United States, and those people, those women in the United States will be thinking that, well, in this on the world, there's a place like India that there's treating women like that. So they will be feeling the anger and the emotions, and they will be willing to support those movement and support those already unadvantageous communities. And therefore, we could have more impactful solutions. For example, if you have one like community social movement and it's only in that one community, no one's there to support you, the effect of the social movement is uncertain and the resources you have is uncertain. But however, if you have other organizations that is popular around the world to support you, then more and more people will start to support you because they believe in the credibility of those organizations. And second is that can local problems make a change in national aspect? Definitely yes, because many social problems around the world are actually similar. For example, feminist movements that are based on women's rights can be seen everywhere around the world. Especially in countries that have cultures that is disrespecting women, and therefore if we collect those similar problems and make it a huge problem around the world, we could definitely raise more awareness. And if we put it into, for example, UN meeting, and therefore we could say all those countries are sharing the same issue, and we urge the change because many countries there are so many people around the world are suffering from the same issue. And yeah, so now moving on to the weighing part. So the first half of this debate is between the opening government and opening opposition are basically talking about if talking about if like the community issues could be solved in a larger scope, and because the Prime Minister mentions that because there's more people to engage in this issue and it's easier to carry out and easier to see their impact. However, I already mentioned that the impact is not certain because you don't have the resources and you don't have the credibility for people to support you. And the LO talks about they don't have talks about like the possibilities of those issues bringing in the national stage, but however they fails to combat against the government side speeches, and they didn't talk about how does the ways from the government side is impossible, just like our side says. So we always both of them, and we definitely refuted the closing government side, and therefore because we supported that the only prioritizing on community social reforms is basically impossible to raise awareness and cannot grant very specific very specific outcomes. And because we show that if we bring the problem to national stage, we can get better outcomes. We'll definitely win this debate. Thank you.